Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the FIA Group.
Welcome, everyone, to the Empowering Plans Podcast. My name is Corey Crigger. I'm coming from the Louisville, Kentucky office today, where it's a nice 75 degrees, beautiful day. I'm joined today by Nick Bonds, who I believe is joining me from Houston. Nick, how is it down there?
Howdy, Corey. It's a little hotter. It's a little hotter than that down here in Houston. I think today, with the heat index, I think it's about 104. 1,000% humidity. So, living the dream.
Living the dream indeed. Nick, correct me if I'm wrong. We're both podcast veterans at this point, I would say, but our first podcast together was the last podcast we did. Is that right?
I believe that's correct. Yes, sir.
And I was just thinking that podcast seemed like it was just a week or so ago, but really it was a couple months ago that we did that. I was starting to think about just how much has changed in such a short amount of time. We ran into each other at the ICE Forum in Boston, which was great. That was a great time for all of our clients. Not only personally, I found out I was having twins since then, but even in the healthcare world, it seems like there's just so much that's been kind of going on. We had the Supreme Court cases that came down earlier in the summer, Dobbs and Marietta. We had some Q2 earnings calls that came out, and CVS doubled down on the fact that they're planning on purchasing a primary care provider. Just last week, a New York judge upholds a few key portions of the No Surprises Act that kind of puts some uncertainty to rest. And that's just kind of the stuff that's been on my radar the last month or so. What's going on over on the consulting side?
Well, first off, I got to say congratulations on the twins, Corey. That's exciting. I don't know if you knew that when I saw you in Boston, but if I didn't tell you, congratulations then. Let the record show. I'm excited for you and your twins, bud.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, so much has been going on, on top of the Supreme Court cases, on top of, CVS merging. There's a few other big things that came out recently. I think a lot of our clients have probably seen that HHS published new proposed rules on Section 1557 enforcement. You all out there are probably pretty familiar, but that's essentially the primary non-discrimination provision of the Affordable Care Act. It's been through a bit of tumult over the past few years. There were 2016 rules implementing that regulation that were sort of supplanted by 2020 rules that were themselves enjoined in a series of lawsuits and essentially were largely unenforceable that have now been superseded by a brand new set of Section 1557 regulations. So that's a lot of exciting stuff that plans are going to have to keep an eye out for once they're finalized coming up here soon. Another thing, I think you mentioned it, but just everything still shaking out from the No Surprises Act. There's been a lot to unpack there still as plans and groups they work with are getting a little more familiar with those requirements. One thing that we're starting to see, a lot of plans are trying to figure out how they're going to handle claims that they might have to pay out more on after the fact as they go through the IDR process under the NSA. And that's something that, they're going to have to factor in with their stop-loss carriers. It's sort of like when the ACA's requirements for an IRO kicked in and groups found themselves having to pay out more money well beyond the time that the claims were originally incurred and maybe beyond the plan year itself. Some stop-loss carriers started offering IRO coverage endorsements, where essentially you could still get those claims that were paid well beyond the normal payment deadline, still get those considered for reimbursement. So that's something that we're starting to see some carriers think about, some groups think about as they're out shopping for stop-loss policies, and something you might talk about with your stop-loss carrier next time it comes up. And then another big thing, the Inflation Reduction Act here pretty recently was just signed into law by President Biden, and it includes a few things that'll be interesting for the healthcare industry, namely Medicare no longer prohibited from negotiating drug prices. They can negotiate prices now on a few drugs. Corey, you may know better than I do, but there's a select subset of prescription drugs Medicare can negotiate prices on. There's capping on out-of-pocket spending for Medicare Part D on insulin prices, which is going to be really good. And then the ACA premium subsidies that were increased under ARPA are actually now getting extended through 2025. So those are a few of the big recent developments having come out here lately. And then I sent you an email on this last night, Corey. Some exciting news out of the FDA. You want to set me up for that one?
Yeah, absolutely. And just, here at FIA, we, especially the Nick and Corey version of the Empowering Plans podcast, we are transparent. So transparent that we'll let you behind the curtain. And the industry has changed so fast that Nick and I pivoted on what this podcast was going to be about at about 5:30 yesterday afternoon after we were able to dive into some news from the FDA. Before we get to that, I will say that we are going to keep a portion of what we were going to discuss intact a little bit later. We're going to discuss some of the changes in the healthcare industry, specifically as it relates to medical debt, because tons of news going there. And originally that was going to be the focus of this podcast. But when the news came out from the FDA yesterday, for those who haven't heard about the news from the FDA yesterday, Nick, why don't you fill the people in?
Well, I guess you might say, Corey, that a lot more people might be able to hear it. But the FDA essentially announced that they are finalizing a new rule, essentially allowing for over-the-counter hearing aids. Previously, generally speaking, to get a hearing aid, you had to see your primary care, you had to get referred to an audiologist or another specialist, and they had to do a full evaluation of hearing tests and write you a prescription that you had to take to get a hearing aid. And that whole process, one, is just cumbersome, so fewer people were likely to take advantage of it. It's expensive. I think the average cost of hearing aids can vary shockingly wildly, depending on where you are, what kind of coverage you have, what kind of hearing aid you need, and what kind of evaluations you have to go through. The price for all of those services plus the hearing aid device itself can range anywhere between $1,000 to upwards of $5,000 to $8,000, and that's just a pretty significant cost for most plan participants, not to mention the plans themselves. So this news from the FDA will essentially allow adults 18 and older with mild to moderate hearing loss, they'll be able to get certain types of hearing aids over the counter, which means more device manufacturers will be able to step into the space, be able to create a wider variety of hearing aids, ideally cheaper, more easily available hearing aids. Just the fact that there will be so much fewer steps that the participants have to go through to get a hearing aid means more people will be able to take advantage of it. They'll be able to use hearing aids earlier in life. They'll be able to get more benefit from those hearing aids. They'll have fewer hearing problems down the line. They're more likely to get their hearing issues diagnosed earlier on. I think it's really a win for just about everybody in the health plan space here. So there's a lot to be excited about. I think that the rule kicks in 60 days from when it was announced. So it was announced yesterday, August 16th. So about the middle of October, you could see some big shakeups. You can see more hearing aids available for purchase behind the counter at your local CVS. So there's a lot to unpack there. It'll be a big shift for sure.
Absolutely. A couple things. Hearing aids, something that I've experienced through my grandfather. And you briefly mentioned the steps there, right? Primary care physician, then you got to get referral to an audiologist. My grandfather was a veteran. So now throw the red tape of the VA into that mix before you can ever get to being able to actually get your hearing aid fitted. And then, God forbid, it ever break or need repair, you're back into another bunch of red tape. So I certainly think that this is a great step forward. You touched there, Nick, a little bit on competition, right? Competition, more readily available hearing aids, in theory, driving the price down because there's readily available alternatives. All great things. Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, a little bit of conjecture here, right? Because it just came out yesterday. But in my mind, when I heard this, when I read the release, what immediately made me think about is that little stand of cheaters or readers glasses that you can pass by in Walmart or Costco, right? Where, my mom goes by and tries 10 pairs on, and they kind of help a little bit. They're not perfect. They're not dialed in the same way as if she would have went to an optometrist. But for mild vision issues, there's certainly nothing wrong with them. Do you think that that's a proper analogy for where we are right now with the hearing aids based on what we know? Or maybe, wait and see, and it could be a little bit more different than that?
Yeah, Corey, I'd say that's a pretty solid analogy, except I'm not sure how many hearing aids they'll let you try on at CVS, but you try on as many as you can get away with, and we'll see what you make it out of there wearing. But yeah, I think that's a good way to think of it. It's not for everybody. Obviously, not everyone will ultimately need hearing aids. Other people might still need to go through that process of seeking out an audiologist or getting a hearing aid with a little more horsepower if they have more severe hearing loss or need something more along the lines of like a cochlear implant or something. But for mild to moderate hearing loss, this could really fill kind of that stopgap between people who, don't want to deal with all the red tape they have to go through to get that higher end hearing aid. The people that have the more moderate hearing issues, they'd be able to address that a little more easily, a little more efficiently, and a little more cheaply.
Excellent. Yeah. And of course, we wanted to talk about it because it is timely. You can certainly see how plans might want to address this in different ways. So we want to make sure that we took a portion of the podcast to talk about some breaking news from the FDA yesterday. So we thank you so much, Nick, for your input on that. And I really think that that's an excellent change from the FDA for those with hearing loss or hearing impairments. It's certainly better to have more options than less options, specifically when you're dealing with either a full-fledged disability or maybe it's not that far, maybe it's just an inconvenience for you. Rather have too many options than not enough. So that's excellent. So now, with a seamless segue, because if you paid for your hearing aids before when they were prescription only, you probably were on the verge of bankruptcy, at least if you went through them as quick as my grandfather went through his, and they were not cheap, was the fact that medical debt, the views around medical debt and what that means when a bill goes to collection, that the industry is changing on how it's viewing medical debt. Let me just give you some stats, Nick. You may or may not have heard these, but these are near and dear to my heart. I'm on our provider relations side for those out there in the audience who don't know. So I deal a lot with balance billing, with bills coming in, with the threat of collections and the threat of credit impairment. Here's just a couple stats, right? This first one comes from the Kaiser Family Foundation. 10% of the U.S. population has medical debt. That's 23 million people. This article from the Kaiser Family Foundation was written by Craig Pulowski. Okay, a couple more stats from that same article. 3 million of the 23 million people with medical debt, they owe $10,000 or more, and there's $88 billion worth of medical debt. $88 billion worth of medical debt. I think I saw an infographic the other day that showed Elon Musk's current net worth at $174 billion and Bill Gates' net worth at $101 billion. So what you're talking about is an amount of money that is astronomical to even fathom the amount of money.
Basically, 0.5 Musks, basically.
Right, yes. I like that. Maybe we should just start rating things on the Musk scale. That's going to be patent pending. No one else out there use that.
That's right. That's ours.
Yeah, that is property of Nick and Corey. It's mind-blowing to think about that. And then, of course, what that means is that the collection efforts start, right? The phone calls start. The letters start. The worry comes in. And, I've always said that if you're a low-income person trying to make ends meet and you're looking at your bills, right, Nick, on your table, your kitchen table, you're going through your bills, and you have your power bill or a medical bill. Nick, if you got a couple kids and a spouse there, which bill gets paid first?
I'm going to say the power bill. I'm going to keep the lights on.
Absolutely. Power is going to get paid first. Groceries going to get paid first. Gas is going to go in the car. All these things rank ahead of medical debt. And we've all known this for a long time. This isn't new information. This is something that the FIA group's been talking about for a long time. But what is starting to change is how the lending industry is looking at medical debt and how the credit bureaus and the credit reporting agencies are starting to view medical debt. And they're starting to look at that the same way that we're looking at this. This is a quote from the CEO of VantageScore. For those of you who don't know, VantageScore provides credit scores, and they are owned by the three large credit bureaus that we all kind of know about, like right off the tip of our tongue, right? VantageScore is owned by TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian. And the CEO of VantageScore had a quote that came out that basically said that VantageScore Solutions is no longer going to factor in medical debt when calculating credit scores. And this decision was made, and here's the quote from the CEO, Silvio Tavares. He said that, there's medical collection is not good at predicting a person's likelihood of repaying other debts. That's the whole purpose of a credit score to begin with. Am I right? You need to evaluate the risk of giving someone a loan and whether or not they're likely to repay it. Well, the CEO of one of the largest purveyors of credit scores in the country has said you know what, medical debt, people don't treat that like all their other debt. So it's not a good indicator of whether or not they're going to pay other debt back. So we're just not going to include it in our credit scores. Nick, gut reaction when you hear something like that. What do you think?
That to me feels like a relief. Just as someone whose family has dealt with its fair share of medical debt, and I know the weight that some of those debts can bear. I think it's a key distinction to medical debt that it's not like repaying a student loan or a mortgage. It's not something that you can necessarily plan for and predict for and shop around for the best rate. When you incur medical debt, usually you have very little choice in the matter, and you may not be prepared for that kind of debt and may not have a way to move forward if you don't have the kind of coverage that we try to help our plans develop for their groups. Knowing that that's not going to impact your credit score, that's not going to impact your ability to get a car loan or a mortgage loan, not like it used to at any rate, if Silvo Severez has anything to say about it. I think that that's a very positive development. And I think that it may take some time to see how it shakes out fully, but I think there's a lot of excitement around that idea.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there, right? The only thing that I would add is that, Vantage Score, although reputable, although it's owned by those three big companies, TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian, the more commonly used credit score is the FICO credit score, right? And that's a different entity. And there's still that entity. So if your loan's going to be dependent on your FICO credit score, this doesn't help you out yet, is what I would say. Yet. It doesn't help you out yet. There's always a forerunner of progress. We saw Washington, Colorado, California when it came to no surprise billing, right? They were kind of the forerunners of eliminating surprise bills from hitting the mailbox of a consumer. And now here we are federally. We have the No Surprises Act that went into effect 1/1/22. So I look at this as a glass half full guy and say, hey, we have a forerunner here. We have a CEO of a major player in that industry saying medical debt is different than all other debt, and there's no reason that we should inhibit people from buying a new house or buying a new car based on medical debt, because it's just so rampant and it's so crushing. And of course, I could do an hour on this, Nick, so I'm not going to do it, but it's artificially inflated, right? The medical debt is the difference between the billed charges and the amount that was paid by the health plan. But guess who gets to throttle the billed charges when they want to? That's all one-sided. So I think that this is a great step forward in the industry. Couple other things before we close here that has went on as far as medical debt comes, right? So TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian stated that beginning July 1st, that they won't include any medical debt. Medical debt collection amounts $500 or lower won't be included on any kind of their reporting. And that was July 1. So you get a little bit of overlap here. So you can see how TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian, they kind of took that first step. And then eventually Vantage Score, who is owned by those three companies, they took a step further. And then medical debt must be in collections for a year before it's going to be allowed to affect anyone credit negatively. So if a collection, that's up from 6 months. So a collector has a medical debt prior to this summer, they only had to hold it for 6 months before they could report it and it had a negative impact. That was expanded out to a year. So that's still going to affect credit scoring across the industry, regardless of whether or not it's Vantage Score or FICO Score. So I think that those are excellent steps forward. It doesn't solve the problem completely, but what I love to see is that we're starting to piece together a lot of these things that we've been working towards the last 10, 15, 20 years in the industry, right? More transparency, more leniency, the understanding that medical debt is different, the fact that billed charges aren't tied to necessarily the cost of treatments. We're getting a lot of reaction. We're getting a lot of change in the industry. And, I heard a wise man once said that the times they are a-changing. And I think that it's certainly true in the healthcare industry today more than ever, that there's continual change going on within the industry. Nick, final shots, final talking points. What would you like anyone to take away from this podcast? One big thing.
One big thing. Well, I don't know how you're hearing doing these days, Corey, but I imagine once those twins come along, it'll take a big hit. So maybe this will help you out in the future, bud.
You know what? Nick's one big thing, very self-centered. I love it. the fact that he will have to solo carry a podcast later in the year because I have twins. That's Nick's one big thing. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Nick, for the congratulations. My wife is the one who's going through it right now. We're all doing well. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day to listen to the Empowering Plans podcast. It's always a pleasure. I always enjoy it. Hopefully you were able to take something away. And if you have any questions, please reach out to the FIA group. We'll be more than happy to answer any questions. Have a nice day, everyone.